"Do you know who I am?" The question was cold, but the sound that followed was colder. The slap hit before the pain did, sharp, flat, and wrong. It was the kind of sound that had no place in a hospital, especially not in a hallway meant for healing. Yoo-hae staggered back, her head snapping sideways from the force. One hand flew to her burning cheek, while the other instinctively dropped to her 7-month-old belly. The baby kicked, a frantic, rolling movement as if she felt the shock through her mother's skin. Everything in the ICU stopped. The nurses, the doctors, and the orderlies froze in their tracks. Nobody moved because nobody hits a pregnant nurse in the middle of a cardiac unit. And yet, the clipboard lay shattered on the floor, papers scattering like broken wings. Jang Taesung stood there in his tailored suit, his expression unmoved as he calmly adjusted his cufflink. He looked at Haein not as a person, but as an obstacle he had simply swatted aside. He had no idea that the silent man rounding the corner was about to make him regret every breath he took. If you're still here, still watching, still listening, then this story has you. Do me a quick favor before we go deeper. Hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next, you don't want to miss it. Yoo-hae's feet ached with a dull, throbbing persistence that felt like it had moved into her bones. It was the kind of pain that didn't go away with a short sit-down or a glass of water. She had been on her feet for nearly 10 hours, and the compression socks beneath her white scrubs were doing little to help the swelling in her ankles. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required a conscious calculation of balance and energy. She leaned against the nurse's station for a brief second, pressing her palm into the small of her back, where the weight of her daughter seemed to pull the hardest. The ICU was a world of controlled chaos, a place where the air always smelled of antiseptic, and the hum of ventilators served as a constant heartbeat. Haein had worked this floor for years, and she was good at it. She was the one the younger nurses looked to when a patient's vitals began to dip, the one who stayed calm when the monitors started screaming. They saw her as a rock, a steady professional who never let her personal life bleed into the sterile environment of the hospital. They didn't know that the man whose name was etched into the glass of the director's office 3 floors up was the same man who had kissed her forehead that morning. Haein adjusted her hospital ID badge, which currently rested at an awkward angle against her maternity scrubs. It read simply, Yoo-hae RN. She liked it that way. When she had married Seo Kangjin 4 years ago, they had made a silent pact. He was the brilliant medical director, a man whose family had built empires, and she was a frontline nurse who took pride in the work of her own hands. She didn't want to be the director's wife. She wanted to be the nurse who saved lives because she was capable, not because she was protected. Kangjin had respected her choice, though it often pained him to see her coming home with dark circles under her eyes and a back that felt like it was breaking. They lived a double life, one of high-stakes hospital politics for him and grueling physical labor for her. They drove to work in separate cars and kept their interactions in the hallways limited to professional nods. On the rare occasions they passed each other in the cafeteria, nobody suspected that the powerful man in the expensive suit spent his evenings rubbing lotion into the feet of the tired nurse in room 4. Haein straightened her back and grabbed a fresh stack of charts. She had 2 hours left on a shift that felt like it would never end. Her daughter moved again, a slow, heavy roll that made Haein catch her breath. It was a reminder of why she was doing this, of the life they were building together. She tucked a loose strand of hair back into her practical bun and checked the monitor for Mr. Kim in room 12. The weight of the pregnancy was becoming a physical burden she could no longer ignore, but her pride kept her moving. She had worked too hard to build this identity for herself. She didn't want the special treatment that came with being a CEO. She wanted to be a nurse who stood on her own, even if her legs were shaking. As she walked toward the next patient, she caught her reflection in the glass of the medication cabinet. She looked tired, pale, and entirely ordinary. In this hospital, she was invisible to the elites who walked the upper floors. She was just another uniform, another worker in the machine. It was a safety she had cherished, a quiet life she had fought to maintain. But as the elevator dings echoed at the end of the hall, signaling the arrival of something new and disruptive, that invisibility was about to become her greatest vulnerability. She didn't know that within the hour, her hidden world and her working world were going to collide in a way that would change everything. She simply took a deep breath, adjusted her scrubs over her stomach, and stepped into the next room to do her job. The chime of the VIP elevator was different from the others, sharper, more insistent, as if the machine itself was anxious to announce who was inside. When the doors slid open, the atmosphere of the ICU didn't just change, it curdled. The usual sounds of shifting monitors and quiet footfalls were swallowed by the heavy, rhythmic stride of men who didn't belong in a place of quiet recovery. Jang Taesung stepped into the hallway like he was walking onto a stage he already owned. He was a man defined by sharp edges and expensive tastes, dressed in a tailored gold-tan luxury suit that seemed to catch every fluorescent light in the ceiling. His hair was perfectly swept back, not a single strand out of place despite the hour, and his posture was so upright it bordered on a challenge. He didn't look like a man in need of medical attention. He looked like a man arriving to buy the building and everyone inside it. Behind him, 3 large men in dark, silent suits followed in a formation that suggested they were more of a perimeter than an escort. They didn't look at the patients or the grieving families in the waiting area. They looked at doors, exits, and anyone who dared to get too close to their employer. Haein was at the central nursing station, updating a chart for a patient who had just stabilized after a grueling night. She felt the shift in the room before she saw the cause. The younger nurses, like Priya, had already stopped what they were doing, their eyes wide and their hands hovering over keyboards. Taesung didn't stop at the reception desk. He walked right up to the counter, his presence forcing the air out of the small space. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he raised his right hand and set it flat on the sterile white surface of the desk. A white bandage was wrapped clumsily around his palm, a small, singular spot of red blooming through the gauze. It was a minor laceration, the kind of injury that a school child could treat with a bit of ointment and a Band-Aid. It certainly wasn't an ICU matter. "I need a room," Taesung said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a terrifying, flat quality to it, the sound of a man who had never in his life considered the possibility of being told no. Priya, her voice trembling, looked up from her computer. "Sir, this is the intensive care unit. We only admit patients in critical condition." "The emergency room downstairs is..." Taesung's eyes didn't even flicker toward her. He didn't acknowledge her words or her existence. He simply looked past her at the hallway behind the desk. "I didn't ask for a lecture on your protocols. I want a private room, now, with a door that locks and a doctor who knows how to keep his mouth shut." Haein stepped forward then. She moved with the slow, steady gait of someone who had seen every kind of crisis and refused to be shaken by a man in an expensive suit. She could feel the weight of her pregnancy pulling at her spine, a reminder of the life she was protecting, but she kept her face a mask of professional calm. "Mr. Jang," she said, her voice steady and level. "I'm Yu Haein, the charge nurse for this floor. I can see you have a hand injury. We can certainly get that cleaned and stitched for you, but we don't have private suites for minor lacerations. Every bed on this floor is currently occupied by a patient fighting for their life." Taesung finally turned his head. He looked at Haein, his gaze starting at her tired eyes, moving down to the name on her badge, and lingering for a long, insulting moment on her swollen stomach. A small, cold smile touched the corner of his mouth, not a smile of kindness, but one of recognition. He saw a woman he deemed beneath him, someone he could easily crush with a phone call or a checkbook. "You're a nurse," he said, his tone dripping with a quiet, casual disdain. "You handle the pillows and the bedpans. I am telling you what I need." He reached into the inner pocket of his gold suit and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. He didn't look at the numbers as he wrote, his movements fluid and practiced. He ripped the page out and slid it across the counter. The paper sat there, a white rectangle filled with more zeros than Hayen would earn in a decade. For the hospital's new wing, he said, or for whatever equipment you're currently lacking. In exchange, you will move whoever is in the private room at the end of this hall, and you will do it in the next 5 minutes. Hayen didn't even look at the check. Her eyes stayed locked on his, dark and unwavering. Behind her in room 6, an elderly man was hooked to a ventilator, his daughter holding his hand as they waited for a miracle. That man was a father, a person, and a patient. To Hayen, he was worth more than any donation. Money doesn't create space where there is none, Mr. Jang, Hayen replied. And it doesn't buy a patient's right to care. We are not moving anyone. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The bodyguards behind T-Sung shifted, their shadows lengthening against the white walls. T-Sung's face didn't redden with anger. Instead, it went perfectly still, his eyes turning into shards of ice. He looked at the pregnant woman standing in front of him and saw a barrier that needed to be removed. He didn't see a person. He saw a nuisance. And in his world, nuisances were dealt with quickly and without mercy. The tension in the hallway felt like a physical weight, pressing against Hayen's chest as she stood between the billionaire and the door to room 6. Behind that door lay Mr. Park, a man whose heart had failed him twice in the last 12 hours. He was barely holding on, surrounded by humming machines and a daughter who hadn't let go of his hand since she arrived. To move him now wasn't just a violation of protocol, it was a death sentence. Jang T-Sung tapped his manicured fingers against the check he had just written, the sound rhythmic and hollow. He didn't look at the monitors or the pale faces of the other patients. He only looked at Hayen, his eyes tracking the way she shifted her weight to support her stomach. He saw her exhaustion as a weakness he could exploit, a crack in the armor of her professional resolve. "I don't think you heard me," T-Sung said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "I'm not asking for a favor. I am providing a gift to this institution that will save more lives than the one currently wasting away in that room. It's a simple matter of math. One failing heart versus the future of this entire wing." Hayen didn't blink. She felt her daughter move again, a sharp kick against her ribs that grounded her. "That patient is not math, Mr. Jang. He is a person. And right now, he is my priority. Your injury is a laceration that requires 10 minutes of care in the urgent care clinic. You are asking me to risk a life for your comfort. I won't do it." A few feet away, the younger nurses watched with their breaths held, their faces pale under the harsh LED lights. They knew the name Jang T-Sung. They knew the stories of board members being fired and businesses being dismantled over a single slight. They wanted to pull Hayen back, to tell her to just give him what he wanted before things got worse, but something about the way she stood her ground kept them silent. T-Sung stepped forward, invading her personal space until the scent of his expensive cologne overpowered the smell of antiseptic. He leaned in, his shadow falling over her scrubs. "You think this is about a room," he whispered, so low that only she could hear. "You think you're being a hero. But in 5 minutes I can have your license revoked. I can have this floor cleared of every person you care about. I can make it so you never work in this city again. Is that old man worth the future of the child you're carrying?" The threat was clear, cold, and calculated. It wasn't the heat of a man losing his temper. It was the steady pressure of someone who used his power like a scalpel. Hayen felt a flicker of fear, a cold shiver that traveled down her spine, but she didn't move. She thought of Mr. Park's daughter, the way she had looked at Hayen with tear-filled eyes, thanking her for taking such good care of her father. She thought of the oath she had taken before she ever met Seo Kangjin, before she ever knew what real power looked like. "Yes," she said, her voice small but unbreakable. "He is." T-Sung pulled back, his face a mask of absolute stillness. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually turn around and leave. He looked down at the bandage on his hand, then back at the check on the counter. The entitled control he had maintained since stepping off the elevator finally snapped, replaced by something dark and jagged. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone he considered a servant. "You people always forget your place," T-Sung said. "You think because you wear a badge and a uniform, you have some kind of authority over me. You're just a girl in a pair of cheap scrubs who doesn't know when to be quiet." The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. The hum of the machines felt louder, more frantic. One of T-Sung's bodyguards moved closer, his hand resting near his jacket, but T-Sung held up a finger to stop him. He didn't need his men for this. He wanted to feel the moment himself. He wanted to see the light of defiance go out in her eyes. Haein opened her mouth to tell him to leave once more, to call for security, but she never got the chance. The transition from words to violence was instantaneous. T-Sung didn't shout. He didn't wind up. He simply moved with a sharp, practiced efficiency, his hand leaving his side in a blurred arc. The sound of the impact was a sickening crack that echoed off the tile walls and the glass partitions. It was the sound of bone meeting skin, of power meeting vulnerability. Haein's head snapped to the side, her vision exploding into white spots as the force of the blow sent her reeling. Her practical bun came loose, strands of hair falling over her face as she stumbled back. She didn't cry out. The shock was too deep for a scream. As she lost her balance, her only thought was for the life inside her. She twisted her body as she fell, slamming her shoulder against the medication cart to keep from landing on her stomach. Her hand went to her belly instantly, a protective shield against a world that had suddenly turned cruel. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person in that hallway moved. Not the nurses, not the doctors, and not the bodyguards. Everyone stood paralyzed by the sight of a pregnant woman crumpled against a cart, her face already beginning to bruise, while the billionaire stood over her, calmly adjusting his cufflink as if he had just finished a minor business transaction. The entitlement had turned deadly, and in that moment, the ICU became a crime scene. The sound of the impact lingered in the air long after the physical blow had landed. It was a sharp, wet crack that seemed to echo off the glass walls of the ICU, vibrating through the heart of everyone standing in that hallway. For a second, time didn't just slow down, it stopped. The constant hum of the ventilators and the rhythmic chirping of the heart monitors felt like they belonged to a different world. In this world, there was only the sight of Yu Haein crumpled on the floor and the man who had put her there. Haein lay against the cold tile, her shoulder wedged against the metal frame of the medication cart. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The left side of her face was already beginning to throb, a deep, pulsing heat that made her vision swim. But the physical pain was secondary to the terror that gripped her chest. Her right hand was pressed firmly against her stomach, her fingers digging into the fabric of her scrubs as if she could physically hold her daughter away from the violence. She waited for a contraction, for a cramp, for any sign that the shock had reached the life inside her. 20 feet away, a group of doctors and nurses stood like statues. These were people trained to run toward trauma, people who spent their days reviving the dying and stitching the broken. Yet in the face of Jang T-Sung's casual cruelty, they were paralyzed. Priya, the young nurse who had been at the desk, had her hands clamped over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of horror and a desperate, suffocating fear. She looked at Haein, then at the 3 massive bodyguards flanking the billionaire. She knew that if she moved, if she reached out to help her friend, the life she had built, her career, her visa, her family's pride, could be wiped out with a single word from the man in the gold suit. The chief of medicine, Dr. Choi, stood near the elevator. He was a man who spoke often about the sanctity of the hospital and the safety of his staff. He saw the bruise forming on Haein's cheek. He saw her struggling to sit up while protecting her belly. But he also saw the check still sitting on the counter, and he saw the cold, bored expression on T-Sung's face. Choi's gaze dropped to his own shoes. He adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling, but he didn't step forward. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't even call for security. The silence was the most painful part. It was a heavy, collective choice to look away. To Haein, The lack of movement from her colleagues felt like a second blow. She looked up through a veil of loose hair, her eyes searching the faces of the people she worked with every day, the people she had shared meals and double shifts with. She saw pity, she saw shock, but mostly, she saw the terrifying math of self-preservation. They were weighing her worth against the power of the man standing over her, and she was losing. Taesung didn't look at the witnesses. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what his presence did to a room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief, slowly wiping a small speck of dust from his sleeve. He looked down at Hae-in, his shadow stretching over her like a shroud. "You should have taken the check," he said. His voice was conversational, almost gentle, which made it 10 times more haunting. "It's a pity. You were a good nurse, I am sure. But you lack the most important skill for survival. You don't know when to bow." He turned his back on her then, as if she were nothing more than a discarded piece of medical waste. He motioned to his men, and they began to move toward the private suite in room 6, the very room Hae-in had been trying to protect. As they walked past her, one of the bodyguards purposely kicked the shattered clipboard out of his way, sending the metal tray skidding across the floor with a harsh, metallic screech. Still, nobody moved to help her. Hae-in managed to push herself up into a sitting position, her back against the cart. Her head was spinning, and a single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't cry because of the slap. She cried because of the stillness of the hallway. She realized in that moment that she was truly alone. The institution she had served, the colleagues she had trusted, and the rules she had followed had all vanished the moment a more powerful force entered the room. She took a deep, shaky breath, feeling the baby give a small, tentative kick. A wave of cold, hard clarity washed over her. If the hospital wouldn't protect her, if the law wouldn't reach this high, and if her friends were too afraid to speak, she would have to stop trying to handle this as a nurse. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against her phone. The secret she had kept for years, the safety of her husband's shadow, was no longer a burden of pride. It was her only weapon left. As Taesung's men began to wheel Mr. Park's bed out of room 6 to make room for their master, Hae-in watched with a bruised face and a hardening heart. The witnesses continued to stand by, their silence a permanent stain on the white walls of the ICU. They thought they were watching a woman be defeated. They had no idea they were watching the last few minutes of Jang Taesung's empire. The silence in the ICU was finally broken, but not by an apology. It was broken by the clinical, hurried footsteps of Dr. Choi, the chief of medicine. He didn't go to Hae-in, who was still bracing herself against the medication cart. He went straight to Jang Taesung. He bowed low, a quick, jerky movement that signaled a complete surrender of the hospital's dignity. "Mr. Jang, I am deeply sorry for this unprofessional display," Dr. Choi said, his voice thin and desperate. "We value your partnership above all else. Please, let my staff escort you to the executive lounge while we prepare the suite immediately." Taesung didn't even look at him. He just gestured toward Hae-in with a flick of his wrist. "Get this woman out of my sight, and make sure she never walks through these doors again." Dr. Choi turned toward Hae-in. The pity that had been in his eyes moments ago was gone, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic hardness. He needed a scapegoat to keep the billionaire's check on the counter, and Hae-in was the only obstacle left. "Nurse Yu, follow me to my office," Choi commanded. Hae-in managed to stand, her legs shaking. She didn't say a word as she followed him, her hand still protective over her stomach. Inside the office, the air was still and smelled of expensive floor wax. Choi didn't even sit down. He stayed behind his mahogany desk, refusing to look at the dark bruise blooming across Hae-in's cheek. "You're being terminated, effective immediately," he said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. "Gross insubordination. Endangering a high-value donor. Insubordination." Hae-in's voice was a whisper, raspy from the shock. "I was protecting a patient in critical condition." "He hit me, Dr. Choi. He hit a pregnant woman in your hallway." Dr. Choi finally looked up, his eyes darting to the door to make sure it was closed. "This hospital runs on donations, Hae-in. That man represents a new oncology wing. He represents hundreds of jobs and thousands of future patients. You should have been smarter. You should have known that in this building, some people are more important than others. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small plastic bag. Hand over your badge. Security will escort you to your locker to collect your things. Don't bother asking for a reference. Hayan felt a cold numbness spreading through her. She took the badge from her neck, the badge she had earned through years of night shifts and missed holidays, and set it on the desk. She didn't cry. The betrayal was too deep for tears. She realized then that the hospital wasn't a place of healing. It was a business, and she was an asset that had suddenly become too expensive to keep. The walk to the exit was the longest of her life. 2 security guards, men she used to share coffee with, walked behind her in silence. They didn't look at her. They looked at the walls, their faces tight with a shame they couldn't voice. As she passed the nursing station, the other nurses looked away, burying their faces in charts and monitors. They were afraid that looking at her would make them the next target. When the glass sliding doors opened at the main entrance, the heat of the hospital was replaced by a sudden, biting chill. It was pouring. A late spring storm had turned the Seoul sky into a bruised purple, and the rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets. Hayan didn't have an umbrella. She didn't even have a jacket. She stood under the small concrete overhang, clutching her bag to her chest. Her car was at the far end of the employee lot, a long walk for a woman who could barely breathe through the pain in her face and the weight in her belly. She stepped out into the rain. Within seconds, her white scrubs were soaked, clinging to her skin and making the cold seep into her bones. She walked slowly, her shoes splashing in the growing puddles. Every step felt like a mountain. The rain washed away the salt of her tears, but it couldn't wash away the feeling of being discarded. She reached her car and sat in the driver's seat, the interior smelling of cold upholstery and the lavender air freshener she had bought because she thought it would be calming for the baby. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She was unemployed, blacklisted, and physically hurt. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, the swollen cheek, the wet hair, the exhaustion in her eyes. She thought of the check on the counter. She thought of Dr. Choi's bow. And then she thought of the man who was currently at home, probably checking his watch and wondering why she hadn't called to say she was leaving her shift. Hayan reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers were trembling so hard she almost dropped it. She had spent years trying to be just Yoo Hayan, the nurse. She had fought so hard to keep her husband's power out of her world because she wanted to prove she was enough on her own. But as the lightning flashed across the dark sky and the rain hammered on the roof of her car like a drum, she realized that being enough wasn't enough to fight a monster like Jang Tae-sung. She swiped through her contacts until she found the name that stayed at the top of her list. She didn't call the director. She called her husband. Kang-jin, she said when he picked up on the first ring. Her voice broke, the first sob finally escaping her throat. I am in the parking lot. I can't come home yet. There was a silence on the other end, the kind of silence that precedes a storm far worse than the one outside. Where are you? He asked, his voice low and vibrating with a sudden, sharp focus. The hospital, she whispered. Looking up at the glowing red letters of the ICU wing. They fired me. And he hit me, Kang-jin. He hit me. Hayan closed her eyes as the line went silent again. She knew that silence. It was the sound of a man deciding that the world was about to change. She leaned her head against the cold window, the rain blurring the lights of the city, and for the first time that day, she let herself stop being strong. She knew that by the time the sun rose, Jang Tae-sung would find out exactly what happened when you slapped the wife of Seo Kang-jin. The drive home was a blur of gray rain and the rhythmic, mocking sound of the windshield wipers. By the time Hayan reached her apartment, the adrenaline that had kept her upright in the hospital was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary cold. She stepped inside the small, quiet space she had worked so hard to pay for, her wet shoes tracking water across the floor she had scrubbed just 2 days ago. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't have the energy to face her reflection in the hallway mirror. Instead, she walked straight to the kitchen, her body moving on autopilot. She needed to sit down. She needed to think about how she was going to survive the next month. She reached for the laptop on the kitchen counter, her fingers stiff from the chill. She needed to check her balance, to see exactly how much she had saved for her maternity leave. The humble safety net she had built, penny by penny, so she wouldn't have to ask Kangjin for a single one. She logged into her banking app. The loading circle spun for a moment, then stopped. Red text appeared across the screen, account restricted. Please contact your branch. Hayan stared at the screen, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs. She refreshed the page. The red text remained. She tried her secondary savings account, the one meant for the baby's crib and the hospital fees. Same message. Restricted. Panic, sharp and cold, finally broke through her numbness. She grabbed her phone and dialed the bank's customer service line. After 5 minutes of waiting to a tinny version of a pop song, a voice came on the line, professional and detached. "Sorry, Ms. Yu," the representative said after a few moments of typing. "There is a legal hold on all assets associated with your identity. It appears to be tied to a pending litigation regarding professional misconduct and damages. The freeze was initiated by the legal counsel of the Zhang Group." He felt the air leave her lungs. "A legal hold? I haven't been to court. I haven't even been home for an hour. How can they do this?" "I'm sorry, I don't have those details," the voice replied. "You will need to speak with your legal representative." He ended the call. Her hand dropped to the table, the phone clattering against the wood. She looked at the mail sitting by the door. There was a notice from her landlord, a polite but firm reminder that the rent for her apartment was due in 2 days. She had planned to pay it tonight. Now she couldn't even buy a gallon of milk. Zhang Tisung hadn't just slapped her. He was erasing her. He was using his vast, reach-anywhere power to strip away every bit of independence she had fought for. He was showing her that in his world, a person like her didn't have rights. They only had as much life as he allowed them to have. She tried to stand up to get a glass of water, but her knees gave out. She didn't fall hard, but she slid down the front of the cabinets until she was sitting on the cold linoleum floor. The kitchen was dark, save for the blue glow of the laptop screen and the occasional flash of lightning from the window. Hayan pulled her knees to her chest, or as close as her stomach would allow, and wrapped her arms around herself. She was shaking, not just from the cold of her wet clothes, but from the sheer weight of her helplessness. For years, she had prided herself on being the woman who didn't need the Seo family name. She had wanted to prove that Yu Hayan was enough. But as she sat there in the dark, she realized that the enough she had built was a house of cards that a billionaire had blown down with a single breath. The silence of the apartment felt like it was pressing in on her. She thought of the baby. She felt a small, soft movement, a quiet flutter, and it broke her. The first sob was quiet, a ragged catch in her throat, but the ones that followed were deep and racking. She wept for the bruise on her face, for the job she had lost, and for the terrifying realization that her pride had left her completely unprotected. She was a nurse who knew how to stop a bleed, how to restart a heart, and how to comfort a dying stranger. But she had no idea how to fight a man who could freeze the world with a signature. She stayed there for a long time, her forehead resting on her knees, the cold of the floor seeping through her scrubs. The rain continued to drum against the glass, a constant, lonely rhythm. She felt small. She felt defeated. She felt like the invisible woman Tisung wanted her to be, but then she felt another kick. This one wasn't a flutter, it was strong, insistent, and a reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She reached out and grabbed her phone from the floor where it had fallen. The screen lit up, showing a photo of her and Kangjin on a beach 2 summers ago. He was laughing, his arm around her, looking like a man who would move mountains just to see her smile. She had spent so long running away from his power because she didn't want it to define her. But sitting on this cold floor, she realized that his power wasn't a shadow she had to hide from. It was the shield she had been foolishly refusing to carry. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her movements slow but determined. She didn't call the bank again. She didn't call her landlord. She scrolled to her husband's contact and pressed the icon. When he answered, his voice was already thick with the controlled fury of a man who was already halfway to her. "I'm 5 minutes away, Heian. Stay on the phone." "Kangjin," she whispered, her voice cracking but finally finding its strength. "He took everything. He's trying to make me disappear." "Made a mistake," Kangjin said, and the coldness in his tone was sharper than any slap. "He thinks he's fighting a nurse. He doesn't know he just declared war on me. Don't move from the floor, Heian. I'm coming to bring you home." In leaned her head back against the cabinet and closed her eyes. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. It was the feeling of the wind changing. The cold kitchen floor didn't feel quite so cold anymore. She knew that when the door opened, the quiet life of Yu Heian was over, and the world of Seo Kangjin was going to tear the city apart to find the man who touched her. The phone didn't even finish its first chime before the line clicked open. The silence on the other end wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the static of a man who had been waiting for a sound he hoped would never come. Heian sat on the cold kitchen floor, her wet scrubs heavy against her skin, and for the first time in 4 years, she let the wall between her two worlds crumble. "Kangjin," she whispered. The name felt strange in her mouth. In the hospital, he was Director Seo. In their quiet moments at home, he was just her husband. But right now, calling his name felt like pulling a secondary cord on a parachute. It was a surrender. "I'm here, Heian." His voice was low, vibrating with a frequency that made the glass of water on the counter tremble. "I'm right here." "Tell me where you are." "I'm home," she said, her voice hitching as a fresh wave of tears blurred the blue light of the laptop. "But I don't have anything left. They took my job, Kangjin." "Dr. Choi." He stood there and watched it happen. "And then my accounts. I can't even pay the rent. He's trying to erase me." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a man who was shocked. It was the silence of a predator who had just been given a location. "Who?" Kangjin asked. "Give me the name, Heian." "Jang Tisung," she said. The name hung in the air like a curse. Heian knew that Jang Tisung was a billionaire, a man who thought he sat at the top of the food chain in Seoul. But she also knew her husband. She knew that while Tisung played with money and influence, Kangjin moved in circles where power was measured in life and death. By calling him, she wasn't just asking for help with her bank account. She was unleashing a force that she had spent years trying to keep in a cage. "He hit me," she added, her voice barely audible. "In the ICU." In front of everyone, she heard the sound of a chair being thrown back on the other end of the line. The controlled, professional Director Seo was gone. In his place was a man whose wife was bleeding and whose child was at risk. "Stay exactly where you are," Kangjin commanded. "Lock the door. Don't answer for anyone but me. I'm sending a car for you now, but I am going to the hospital first." "No, Kangjin, wait." "Heian, listen to me," he interrupted, and for the first time he used the tone he usually reserved for boardrooms. "You spent 4 years trying to prove you could survive without my name. You proved it. You're the strongest person I know. But this man isn't playing by the rules of nursing or medicine. He thinks he's found a woman with no one to stand behind her. He needs to find out how wrong he is." Heian leaned her head against the cabinet, closing her eyes. The independence she had cherished felt like a thin, tattered cloak that had finally been ripped away by the storm. She had wanted to be Yu Heian, the self-made woman. But as her cheek throbbed and the red text on her screen mocked her poverty, she realized that being a CEO wasn't a failure of her character. It was the only way to survive a world that allowed men like Tisung to exist. "I'm tired of being invisible," she whispered. "You won't be invisible anymore," Kangjin replied. "From this moment on, everyone who looked away while he touched you is going to wish they had never been born. I'm coming for you." The line went dead. Heian sat in the dark, the only sound the rain against the glass and the frantic beating of her own heart. She felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. The secret was out. The vow was broken. She had called the one person who could stop the world from spinning, and now all she could do was wait for the impact. She reached up and touched the bruise on her face. It felt hot and angry, a mark of a billionaire's ego. But as she heard the screech of tires in the street below and the heavy, rapid footsteps of men approaching her building, she knew the bruise wouldn't be the end of the story. It was just the beginning of Jang Tae-sung's nightmare. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the director's wife, and the director was coming to collect his debt. The storm outside the penthouse windows made the city of Seoul look like a blurred painting of neon and rain. Inside, the air was still, filtered, and smelled of sandalwood and expensive scotch. Jang Tae-sung sat in a leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching the news on a silent screen. He had already forgotten the name of the nurse he had slapped. To him, she was just a momentary friction, a minor glitch in a day that had otherwise gone exactly as he planned. He had signed the donation papers for the hospital's new wing, ensured the nuisance was removed from the payroll, and instructed his legal team to bury her in enough paperwork to keep her silent for a decade. He was a man who slept well because he believed that everything in the world had a price, and he was the one who set the market. The heavy oak doors of his study didn't open with a bang. They slid open with a quiet, terrifying smoothness. Tae-sung didn't even look up at first, assuming it was one of his assistants bringing the evening reports. "I told you I didn't want to be disturbed until morning," Tae-sung said, his voice flat and bored. "Then you should have picked a fight with someone whose husband isn't me." Voice wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that made the glass in Tae-sung's hand vibrate. It was a voice that sounded like shifting tectonic plates. Tae-sung froze. He knew that voice. He had heard it in government briefings and at elite galas where the truly powerful sat in the back rows, watching the billionaires play. Tae-sung turned his head slowly. Standing in the doorway was Seo Kang-jin. He wasn't wearing his white doctor's coat anymore. He was in a dark charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light in the room. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and his expression was so calm it was haunting. There were no guards following him. There was no shouting. There was just a man who looked like he had come to collect a soul. "Director Seo," Tae-sung said, his voice cracking just slightly before he forced his billionaire mask back into place. He stood up, trying to reclaim the height advantage. "This is a private residence. You can't just walk in here because of some hospital dispute. If this is about the donation..." "This is about my wife," Kang-jin interrupted. He walked into the room, his steps silent on the silk rug. He didn't stop until he was standing inches from Tae-sung. The height difference wasn't much, but the gap in presence was an ocean. "You walked into my hospital. You looked at a woman who was 7 months pregnant with my daughter, and you put your hands on her." Tae-sung felt a cold, hollow sensation open up in his stomach. The nurse. The tired woman with the messy bun and the stubborn eyes. He remembered the name on her badge now, Yoo Hae-in. He had seen the name Yoo and assumed she was nobody. He had never considered that she might have kept her own name to hide the fact that she was married to the most dangerous man in the medical and corporate world. I didn't know," Tae-sung stammered, the glass of scotch trembling in his hand. "She was being difficult. She was obstructing a donor. It was a misunderstanding, Kang-jin. I can write a check. I can double the donation. I'll personally ensure she gets her job back with a promotion." Kang-jin looked at the hand Tae-sung had used to deliver the slap. He looked at it with the clinical detachment of a surgeon deciding where to cut. "You think this is a negotiation," Kang-jin said softly. "You think you can buy the bruise on her face. You think you can buy the fear she felt when she fell onto that floor, wondering if her baby was still alive. Do whatever it takes to fix it," Tae-sung said, his voice rising in panic. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling. "I'll call the bank. I'll unfreeze the accounts right now. It was just a legal tactic, nothing personal." "It's too late for the phone, Tae-sung," Kang-jin said. He turned and looked at the television on the wall. He picked up the remote and turned up the volume. The news anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news in the financial sector. The Jang Group is facing an unprecedented federal audit following whistleblower reports of massive embezzlement and safety violations. Trading has been suspended as the CEO's private assets are being seized for investigation." Tae-sung watched his empire vanish in a scroll of red text at the bottom of the screen. He felt his legs grow weak. He dropped back into his leather chair, the glass of scotch slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. The amber liquid spread across the rug like a wound. "You did this?" T-Sung whispered, looking up at Kang-jin. "In 2 hours. You destroyed 40 years of work because of one slap." "No," Kang-jin replied, leaning down so his face was level with T-Sung's. "I destroyed it because you thought your money made you a god. I destroyed it because you forgot that the people you step on have names. My wife's name is Yoo Hae-in, and you are going to remember it every day for the rest of your life while you're sitting in a cell." Kang-jin reached out and straightened T-Sung's gold silk tie, a gesture that was more insulting than any blow. For the first time in his life, Jang T-Sung felt true, paralyzing fear. He wasn't looking at a doctor or a director. He was looking at the end of his life as he knew it. "Police are in the lobby," Kang-jin said, standing up and walking toward the door. He didn't look back. "Id, hurry, they aren't as patient as I am." As Kang-jin walked out of the penthouse, the silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of luxury anymore. It was the silence of a tomb. T-Sung sat in his gold-tan suit, surrounded by his expensive art and his shattered glass, finally realizing that all the money in the world couldn't protect a man who had made the mistake of touching the only thing Seo Kang-jin loved. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a clean, bright light over the city, as if the storm from the night before had scrubbed the world clean. At the main entrance of the hospital, the heavy lifting cranes were already at work. A small crowd of staff gathered near the fountain, their necks craned upward as the old brass letters were lowered to the ground. For decades, the hospital had carried a name associated with corporate donors and boardrooms. But today, a new set of letters was being bolted into the stone. They were simple, elegant, and carried a weight that everyone in the building now understood. It no longer belonged to a conglomerate. It belonged to the people who walked its halls. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The heavy, suffocating fear that had hung over the ICU like a shroud was gone. Dr. Choi's office had been emptied overnight. His nameplate was gone, replaced by a simple notice that the administration was under new, temporary oversight. The nurses who had once looked at their shoes when power walked by now moved with a different kind of energy. They talked a little louder. They held their heads a little higher. The elevator dings announced an arrival on the 4th floor. When the doors opened, the entire nursing station went silent, but it wasn't the silence of terror this time. It was the silence of respect. Yoo Hae-in stepped out. She wasn't wearing the soaked, wrinkled scrubs from the night before. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored maternity sweater and dark slacks, her hair pulled back into a neat, elegant twist. The bruise on her cheek was still there, a fatting purple mark of what she had endured, but she didn't try to hide it with makeup. She wore it like a badge of honor. Behind her walked Seo Kang-jin. He wasn't there as the director today. He walked half a step behind her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, making it clear to everyone watching that he was there as her husband. Hae-in walked straight to the nursing station. Priya was there, her eyes filling with tears the moment she saw Hae-in. The younger nurse started to apologize, her voice trembling, but Hae-in reached out and took her hand, squeezing it firmly. In said softly, "The world is different today. We don't have to be afraid anymore." He, in turn to the rest of the staff, "I'm not here to take my old shift. The board has asked me to oversee the new patient and staff advocacy department. From now on, no one in this building will ever have to choose between their job and their dignity. No check is large enough to buy a room on this floor, and no name is powerful enough to justify a hand being raised against a member of this team." A quiet cheer broke out among the staff, a release of years of pent-up tension. As the paperwork was signed to reinstate every benefit and cent that had been stolen from her, the television in the waiting area flickered with the midday news. Jang T-Sung's face was on the screen, but he didn't look like the man in the gold suit anymore. He was being led out of a police station, his head bowed, his hands hidden under a jacket to conceal the handcuffs. His empire was being dismantled, his assets frozen, and his reputation erased. He was a man who had spent his life buying silence, only to find that the one person he couldn't buy was the one who had brought him down. Hayen didn't look at the screen for long. She had moved past him. She walked down the hall to room 6. Mr. Park was back in his bed, his monitors humming a steady, healthy rhythm. His daughter looked up and smiled, a look of pure relief on her face. Hayen checked the chart, adjusted the IV line with the muscle memory of a woman who loved her craft, and felt a familiar, strong kick against her palm. 2 months later, the hospital held a small, private ceremony. It wasn't for a donation or a new wing. It was for the birth of a baby girl. Hayen sat in a rocking chair in a room filled with flowers from the staff. Kang-jin stood by the window, looking out at the new sign on the building. He turned back to his wife and daughter, his face softened by a peace he hadn't known in years. "She has your eyes," he whispered, leaning down to kiss Hayen's forehead, just above where the bruise had once been. Hayen looked down at her daughter. She had spent so long trying to run away from power, trying to be invisible so she could be independent. But as she held the new life they had created, she realized that true power wasn't about the name on the building or the money in the bank. It was about the strength to stand up when everyone else was sitting down. It was about knowing that you were never truly alone. She looked out the window at the city. Somewhere out there, men like Tae-sung still existed, but they would never again find a home in this hospital. Yoo Hayen was no longer just a nurse, and she was no longer just a wife. She was the woman who had changed the rules of the game. And as her daughter drifted off to sleep, Hayen finally closed her eyes, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of the pregnant nurse didn't end in a slap. It ended in a legacy of justice that would outlast them all. The story of Yoo Hayen and Jang Tae-sung is more than just a tale of a billionaire's downfall. It is a mirror reflecting the hidden costs of power and the quiet strength of integrity. As the dust settles on the ruins of an empire and a new name is etched onto the hospital walls, there are several lessons that stay with us, echoing long after the final word is spoken. The first, and perhaps most vital lesson, is that human dignity is not a commodity. We live in a world that often tries to put a price tag on everything: our time, our loyalty, and even our basic rights. Jang Tae-sung believed that a large enough check could buy the air in a room and the silence of a witness. He looked at a pregnant woman doing her job and saw an obstacle rather than a person. The story reminds us that the moment we begin to value profit over people, we lose our humanity. True power is not measured by what you can buy, but by how you treat those who can do nothing for you. Secondly, this story teaches us about the weight of silence. When the slap echoed through the ICU, the air was filled with the inaction of witnesses. Doctors, nurses, and administrators, people who had dedicated their lives to healing, chose to look at the floor because they were afraid of losing their comfort. Their silence was just as damaging as the blow itself. It reminds us that when we stand by and watch an injustice occur without speaking up, we are helping the person holding the scalpel. Integrity is not just about doing the right thing when it's easy. It's about standing your ground when it's terrifying. Another lesson lies in the complexity of independence. Hayen fought for years to be seen for her own merits, to distance herself from the shadows of a powerful name. Her desire to stand on her own was noble, but her journey shows us that there is no shame in seeking protection when the world turns cruel. We all want to be the heroes of our own stories, but sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is break their silence and ask for help. Community and family are not crutches. They are the shields we carry into battle. Finally, we learn that justice is a slow-moving storm, but it is inevitable. Tae-sung thought he was untouchable because of his bank account, but he forgot that the world has a way of balancing the scales. He exploited a system built on ego, and in the end, that same system crushed him. Justice wasn't just about the billionaire going to jail. It was about Hayen returning to her hallway, not as a victim, but as a leader who ensured that no one else would ever have to feel as small as she did on that kitchen floor. This story was written for everyone who has ever felt invisible in the face of power. It was written for the hardworking people who keep the world running while the elites look past them. If this journey moved you, if you felt the sting of that slap and the triumph of the reveal, then you are the reason we tell these stories. Life is full of real stakes and real pain, but as Haynes showed us, it is also full of real justice. To make sure you never miss a moment of it, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We drop stories like this every week, stories that challenge the status quo and celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Your support means more than you know, and every like, share, and subscription helps us keep these voices alive. Thank you for staying until the very last word. Whether you are watching from a quiet apartment in Seoul, a busy street in London, or anywhere else in the world, know that your presence here matters. I'll see you in the next story.